They said it was routine fire mitigation, just some brush clearing to protect the neighborhood. But 10 minutes later, my $70,000 prize bull was bleeding in the dirt, a bullet through his neck. The men responsible claimed they had orders. The woman who sent them smiled about it. Karen Delaney, the HOA president. Only she didn't know who I was, or that she just bulldozed her way into the worst mistake of her life. It started on a Wednesday, sun high over the hills and the scent of cedar thick in the breeze. I was working in the north field, checking irrigation, when I heard engines rumbling where there shouldn't have been any. Diesel, growling. Tires grinding against gravel in a way no ranch truck ever would. I dropped the wrench and jogged up the slope, boots kicking up dust, heart picking up pace. Not fear, not yet. Just a prickling instinct. Something was off. By the time I got there, it was chaos. A bobcat skid loader chewing through brush. 2 men with weed whackers slicing at the fence line. And one guy, some rent-a-cop type, standing with a clipboard, barking orders like he owned the place. The metal gate had been knocked off its hinges. A HOA property access sign zip-tied to the barbed wire, flapping in the wind like a cheap excuse. My land wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. It never had been. This was private. Clearly marked. Fenced. And they were tearing it apart like it was theirs. I hollered. Loud. The kind of rancher's shout that echoes off the ridgeline and turns heads. Everything paused for a moment. The clipboard guy swaggered up, chewing gum like he was chewing time, and held up his paper like it was a warrant. Said they were contracted by the HOA to conduct mandatory vegetation clearing for fire safety. I told him he was trespassing. He laughed and tapped his badge. Not a sheriff's badge. Not even close. Some neighborhood security patch, barely stitched on straight. He handed me the sheet. There it was, HOA directive, signed by Karen Delaney. No call, no warning. No legal basis. I barely had time to argue when I heard the gunshot. A sharp, cracking sound that seemed to split the air in half. It echoed through the valley like a whip crack. Then silence. One of those awful, stretched-out silences that tells you something's wrong. I sprinted down past the loader and saw them. 2 workers standing frozen, one still holding a smoking rifle, and Brutus, my bull, on the ground. He was massive, even in death. Muscles still twitching, eyes wide, nostrils flaring as blood poured from his neck into the dirt. I dropped to my knees beside him, trying to process the impossible. Brutus wasn't just any bull. He was a grand champion, twice over. A genetic marvel. Calm, gentle, bred from decades of careful selection. Worth more than some houses. And loved. He wasn't just livestock. He was legacy. The worker who fired the shot mumbled something about self-defense. Said Brutus charged. But the gate to his pen had been opened. He'd wandered out, confused by the noise. Brutus didn't charge. He approached, slow and curious, like he always did. The man shot him anyway. I called the sheriff. And while I waited, I filmed everything. The torn gate. The dead bull. The sign. The workers trying to look busy again, pretending they hadn't just ruined a life. When the deputy arrived, they pulled out the same paper, the one with Karen's signature. He frowned, took notes, but said there'd have to be an investigation. Meanwhile, the workers weren't arrested. They weren't even detained. One of them offered me a garbage bag. For the carcass. I didn't reply. Just stood there with my fists clenched until they drove off. The next morning, I showed up at the HOA meeting. I wasn't technically a resident, but that didn't stop me. Karen Delaney was at the front, pearls on her neck and a smug smile stretched across her face like she was chairing a charity gala. The moment she saw me, the smile dipped, but only for a second. I held up a photo of Brutus, sprawled in the dirt, eyes glazed, and laid it on the table in front of her. The room went quiet. She picked up the picture, glanced at it, and shrugged. Said something about unfortunate collateral. She called it an overreaction. Said her team had the right to perform protective cleanup operations. and that I should be grateful they took the initiative. Then she leaned forward and asked, "Why was a dangerous animal allowed to roam free anyway?" I didn't respond to that. I just walked to the back of the room and watched as she spun the narrative for the rest of the board, about how wildfire prevention saved lives, about how neighboring landowners had a responsibility to cooperate for the greater good. I kept my mouth shut, but inside, I was cataloging every word, every smug glance, every half-lie. What Karen didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that just a week earlier, I'd been appointed to the county's Agricultural Oversight Board. I wasn't just some guy with a bull anymore. I was the guy who got to approve or deny HOA expansion permits, conduct livestock welfare reviews, and audit the very documents Karen was waving around like a hall pass. And this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Brutus was gone, and I wasn't about to let the people who killed him laugh their way out of it. I'd already started gathering evidence. Fence line photos. Historical land use records. HOA overreach reports. I had neighbors texting me pictures of the bulldozers. One even sent drone footage from earlier that morning, footage that showed the workers opening Brutus's gate before the shot was fired. That night, I walked the pasture, boots sinking into the cooling earth, Brutus's paddock still and quiet without him in it. I stood there a long time, thinking. Not about revenge. About truth. About legacy. About making sure this never happened again. To any rancher, to any animal, to anyone who thought they were safe just because their land had a fence. Karen thought she could bury this under paperwork and protocol. But she'd made a fatal mistake. She turned the wrong pasture into a battlefield. And I wasn't walking away. The next few days blurred into a storm of paperwork, calls, and tightly measured conversations. I wasn't the type to throw fists or raise my voice, but I'd spent enough years wrangling both cattle and bureaucrats to know that you don't win a war with noise, you win it with precision. Karen Delaney had poked the wrong man. And while she thought I'd sulk over the loss, maybe cry into some hay about my dead bull, I was already knee-deep in something bigger. She'd stepped outside her legal bounds, and I was going to pull every rotten root she had out of the ground. First thing I did was call Judy from the county assessor's office. Judy and I went back 20 years. Her husband and I served on the same wildfire recovery team after the big blaze of '03. She didn't ask questions. I told her I needed every HOA boundary filing, land dispute complaint, and fire mitigation order Karen's name had been attached to in the last 2 years. Judy faxed me 28 pages before lunch. Karen had filed 5 vegetation directives outside her legal HOA zone. 2 of them were already under quiet review for misuse of authority. My land wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a pattern. Then came the calls from neighbors. Word had gotten out. Brutus's picture was floating through local rancher circles, and people were furious. Bob Gillespie, whose horses had once been startled by Karen's weed trimmers, told me his fencing had been trimmed without permission last spring. A widow down the ridge named Maggie had her flower beds torn up because they were too dense for wildfire control. None of them pushed back, just assumed it was legal. Until now. I started collecting statements. Each story added weight. Each picture, each timestamp, each shredded bush was another nail in the coffin of Karen's fake authority. What got me next was the paperwork. Karen had signed off on the wildfire mitigation, under an HOA clause written over a decade ago. But I tracked down the original author of the clause, a retired HOA board member named Liano Sparks, who now lived in Arizona. After 2 awkward calls, Liano told me flat out, the clause was never meant to justify crossing property lines. It was drafted in case abandoned HOA lots got overgrown. He tried to revise it years ago, but Karen blocked the vote. He even emailed me the old meeting notes to prove it. Still, facts only work if you can show them to the right people. And for that, I needed the county. I scheduled a formal meeting with the Agricultural Oversight Committee, the very board I'd just joined. I made sure every chair would be filled, even called in a couple of off-duty members. I didn't mention Brutus's death in the request. I wanted their attention fresh, without the filter of headlines or gossip. When I walked into the meeting room on Thursday, I brought more than a binder. I brought a case. The committee chair, a sharp-tongued woman named Dolores, glanced at the paperwork with her usual skeptical squint. I handed her the photos, the drone footage, the signed directive, the HOA clause, the emails from Liano, and a copy of the veterinary death certificate. She didn't say anything for a long time. Just flipped through each document, slowly, with the kind of silence that makes the air feel heavy. When she reached the page with Karen's signature authorizing temporary access for brush management on adjacent land, Dolores exhaled through her nose and muttered, "She's not gonna like this." That was fine by me. The committee voted to open an emergency review of Karen's HOA authority, particularly her abuse of the fire clause. They also requested she attend a county oversight hearing within 10 business days. I left the meeting and sat in my truck for a few minutes, staring at the hills. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something quieter. A steady kind of justice, unfolding step by step. But I wasn't done. That weekend, I paid a visit to the bull breeder who'd leased Brutus to me for the season, a grizzled man named Russ Porter. He'd raised Brutus's sire, bred half the circuit's champions, and wasn't known for soft feelings. Still, when I showed him the pictures, he didn't say a word. Just lit a cigarette with shaking fingers and walked out to the barn. I followed him in. The air inside was warm, still smelled faintly of sweet feed and oil. Russ reached into a freezer unit and pulled out a box. Inside, sealed in nitrogen vapor, were 3 vials of Brutus's frozen genetic line. "You're gonna want these," Russ said. "They're insured. But more than that, they're Brutus." I nodded, didn't trust myself to speak. That bull had been more than money. More than muscle. He had character. He'd been a presence, a kind of calm in the chaos of livestock work. And now, his bloodline wasn't over. That changed something in me. Made this fight about more than a fine or a legal slap. It became about legacy. A few days later, Karen tried to spin her own story. The HOA posted a notice calling the incident a misunderstanding, claiming that the bull had posed a safety threat to workers doing state-mandated mitigation. It was a lie. And not even a good one. The state had issued no such mandate. And I had the Wildlife Division email to prove it. I could have gone public. Posted it all. Lit up the news cycle. But I waited. Because the county oversight hearing was coming. And Karen would have to sit there, on record, and answer every single question under oath. And when she did, I'd be in that room. I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't need to. The evidence would do it for me. I'd let her trap herself in her own words. Brutus deserved that much. On the eve of the hearing, I walked the perimeter of my ranch with a flashlight and a notepad. Marked the broken gate. Logged every GPS coordinate. Noted which fence posts had been knocked down, and which weeds had been cut without reason. It was quiet. Peaceful. Almost like nothing had happened. But under that quiet was a low hum, like a distant storm waiting to be heard. Karen thought she was dealing with some rancher who'd backed down after losing a bull. She didn't know she was staring down a board member. A policymaker. A man who knew land law better than she knew how to fake a smile. And tomorrow I'd show her. The morning of the hearing arrived quiet and cold, with a kind of sharpness in the air that felt deliberate, like nature itself was watching. I wore a clean button-down, no tie, just like always, and brought 3 copies of every document I'd compiled. I'd rehearsed nothing. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require a performance. It just needed space to breathe. I arrived early, took a seat on the far left side of the conference room, and watched the chairs fill. Some county board members nodded at me on their way in, others offered brief smiles. Not a word was exchanged. Then the door opened again, and in walked Karen Delaney. She came in like she was walking into a fundraiser, not a hearing. Perfectly ironed suit, high heels, makeup flawless, carrying a sleek leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She didn't look at me, but her stride slowed half a second as she passed my row. She was still under the illusion that charm could get her out of this. Still betting that those polished rehearsed statements and her HOA title would carry more weight than the evidence I held in my binder. She had no idea how far gone she already was. When the gavel sounded and the chair called the hearing to order, Karen smiled wide and leaned into the mic like she was giving a campaign speech. She called the incident deeply regrettable, claimed the HOA had acted in good faith, said they'd followed all available guidelines and that the workers were under the impression they were operating in hazard mitigation zones, not private property. She didn't mention Brutus's name. Not once. Just called him the animal, or the livestock. I watched her closely as she spoke. Her voice wavered once, just briefly, when she was asked about the expired licenses of the workers. She had no answer. Claimed she trusted the contracting agency. But the committee chair pressed harder. Why was no official permission sought? Why weren't neighboring landowners notified? Why was there no inspection report filed before operations began? That's when I was called to speak. I didn't bring any speeches. Just the photos, the documents, and my voice. I placed the binder on the table, open to the first page, a dated drone image of my property, untouched, fenced, clearly separate from any HOA zone. I walked them through everything. The gate forced open. The men operating without clearance. The clause that was never meant to apply to non-HOA lands. The satellite image Karen had used to justify it all, which I proved was outdated by nearly 8 months. Then I showed them the footage. The exact moment one of the workers reached for the gate latch. The exact second Brutus stepped out, calm and unaware, and how 30 seconds later he was lying dead in the grass. The room was silent. Every single person was watching that screen like they were seeing something sacred get defiled. Then I played the audio, Karen's voice at the HOA meeting, mocking my loss, laughing about my cow hobby. There was no coming back from that. But the final blow wasn't mine. It came from the county livestock officer, who had quietly joined the back row. He stepped up and confirmed that Brutus had been part of a registered breeding program, insured through the county's agricultural partnership. The bull was not only a genetic asset, but also under legal protection due to his registration in a regional development project. That changed everything. Karen hadn't just caused the death of an animal. She'd destroyed government-supported livestock, violating both zoning laws and state agricultural ethics protocols. The board asked Karen if she had anything to say in response. For the first time, she hesitated. Her lips parted slightly, then closed. She shuffled her papers, but none of them could cover the hole she'd dug. After a long pause, she said it had been an unfortunate oversight. That phrase, clinical, cold, dismissive, landed with the weight of a shovel hitting a coffin. You could see it in the room. Nobody bought it anymore. The votes were counted within the hour. The board declared her authority suspended pending a full investigation. A special hearing would determine if criminal charges should follow. Karen didn't make eye contact as she left the room. She didn't speak. Her heels clicked down the marble hallway, echoing louder than anything she'd said at the mic. And for the first time since that day in the pasture, I let out a slow breath. Not relief. Not celebration. Just something quieter. Like the wind after a storm. But the fallout wasn't over. Within 24 hours, local news picked up the hearing results. Headlines rolled across the morning broadcast. HOA president suspended amid land overreach scandal. Champion bull killed in unauthorized operation. My name started showing up in articles. Reporters called for interviews. I turned most of them down. I didn't want to be a headline. I wanted Karen to face every consequence, not just in court but in reputation. Lawsuits followed. The breeder filed one. I filed another. Neighbors joined in, submitting damages and trespass claims. HOA members, once proudly silent, started asking for emergency elections. Karen's smiling face disappeared from newsletters. Her name was removed from the HOA website. She'd become a liability to the very people she used to control. and I hadn't needed to shout. I hadn't needed to storm in or scream or beg. The truth had done all the work. A week later, I got a call from Dolores, the committee chair. She told me something I hadn't expected. The board had voted to appoint me interim advisor for the Land Use Review Panel. Not just as a symbolic gesture. She said my knowledge of land law, property ethics, and livestock rights had proven more comprehensive than any member they'd had in a decade. I accepted. Quietly. Gratefully. And I hung up the phone knowing this wasn't just a win. It was a beginning. Brutus hadn't died for nothing. His death had exposed a system of arrogance and unchecked authority that had gone on too long. And now, it was being torn out root by root. That night, I walked past the rebuilt gate and down to the edge of the pasture. I stood in the same spot I'd found him, looked out at the quiet fields. I imagined him there again, towering, proud, steady as ever. I remembered how kids used to visit the ranch just to see him. How judges whispered about his lineage. How he'd never once flinched at the sound of thunder or the chaos of county fairs. He had been the calm in the storm. And now it was my turn. The final stretch didn't arrive with trumpets or courtroom explosions. It came in the form of silence. The kind that follows a fall from grace. Karen Delaney vanished from public life almost overnight. The HOA board removed her name from their emails, scrubbed her photo from the newsletter, and appointed a new interim president who immediately began undoing her initiatives. Contractors were dismissed, policies revised, and the clause Karen abused was officially retired. Her supporters either went quiet or turned their backs completely, claiming they'd always had concerns. Karen, once the loudest voice in the community, was suddenly a ghost behind curtained windows and unanswered doors. But the process of justice, the kind that leaves nothing overlooked, still had steps left. The county filed an official inquiry into HOA oversight abuses. That was just the beginning. The sheriff's department reopened a case file regarding unlicensed contractors operating on private property without permission. The state livestock office began its own parallel investigation, this one tied to agricultural sabotage and the destruction of a registered genetic asset. It turned out that Brutus had been part of a federally subsidized program that qualified him for special protections under rural development law. The rifle used to kill him wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was evidence. Meanwhile, I stayed busy. The lawsuit moved forward. The breeder's attorneys came in with force, presenting every piece of documentation I had helped assemble. The case wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. The financial cost of losing Brutus was quantifiable. The emotional cost wasn't. Still, the legal filings added up to a number large enough to make most insurance providers sweat. Karen tried to argue that the workers acted without her instruction, but the signed directive with her signature told a different story. And when her personal homeowner's policy declined to cover legal liability, she found herself alone in a courtroom without the protection of her former title. The ruling came in early spring. A judge ordered Karen to pay restitution for damages tied to Brutus's death, as well as property destruction and emotional distress. It wasn't a criminal conviction, but it was enough to dismantle her remaining reputation. The HOA, wanting to wash their hands of her entirely, agreed to pay part of the settlement in exchange for my agreement to drop pursuit of broader civil penalties. I accepted. Not because I needed their money, but because I wanted closure, and the power to write the next chapter on my own terms. A few days later, I got a call from the county agricultural commissioner. He wanted to talk about outreach programs. Said the board was impressed with how I handled things, not just the hearings, but the aftermath. Said there was a position available, one that would let me shape how these kinds of disputes were handled in the future. Not political. Not flashy. Just good work that mattered. I thought about it for a long moment, standing in the same barn where Brutus used to sleep. Then I said yes. The irony didn't escape me. Karen had tried to control land she didn't own, to force her vision onto people who never asked for her help. In doing so, she'd elevated someone who never wanted the spotlight. And now that spotlight had turned back on her. She was seen everywhere, but not in the way she used to be. A viral post had surfaced. Someone had taken a picture of her in a county-issued vest, picking up trash along the side of the highway. Community service. Part of the settlement agreement. She kept her head down, sunglasses on, but the damage was already done. Her name was now a warning sign to every HOA in the region. I didn't gloat. I didn't post about it. But when I walked into the local feed store and someone slapped me on the back and said, "Heard you brought the queen down," I didn't correct them either. I just smiled and bought a new set of panels for the paddock. The one Brutus used to call home. What most people didn't know was that Brutus wasn't entirely gone. Russ had delivered the vials 2 weeks after the hearing. Frozen, perfectly preserved, and accompanied by a list of potential surrogates. It wouldn't be easy. Breeding from frozen genetics required time, planning, and patience. But I had all three. And the idea that Brutus's bloodline could return, stronger, wiser, with purpose behind it, was something that carried more weight than any court order. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge and cast long shadows across the pasture, I walked out to the marker we'd set by the oak tree. A small bronze plaque sat at the base, simple and steady. It read Brutus, Champion, Guardian, Catalyst. I stood there a while, hands in my pockets, listening to the rustle of the wind through the grass. There was a stillness to it. A final page turned. A story, no longer burning, but folded and set aside with care. I never wanted a war. But when it came to my land, my animals, my peace, I didn't flinch. Karen thought her title gave her power. She forgot that real power isn't in paperwork. It's in presence. In knowing your ground, knowing your truth, and standing so firm that even the loudest lie can't move you. That's what brought her down. Not a speech. Not a threat. Just steady, unshakable truth. In the months that followed, the ranch got quieter. Greener. The new fencing held strong. A few local kids started coming by again to help with feed runs and chores. I showed them how to brush the younger calves, how to check hooves, how to walk slow and speak softer around the nervous ones. I told them stories about Brutus, not the one where he got shot, but the ones where he stood between a child and a rattlesnake, or when he calmly led a stray heifer back through a gate like he was the foreman of the whole place. Those were the stories I wanted to last. Not the anger. Not the loss. But the legacy. One spring morning, as I stepped out with a mug of black coffee and watched the mist roll across the lower fields, I heard the distinct snort of a young bull in the training pen. Not full-grown yet. But tall. Alert. Built like his father. He kicked at the dirt once, shook his head, and turned to face me with the same calm defiance Brutus once had. That look. That posture. It hit like thunder without the noise. I didn't need to name him. I already knew who he was.